Professor Stevenson, what in your view are the main policy measures needed to ensure that the United States achieves an inclusive recovery from the pandemic? And do you see the current administration taking the right steps to address this challenge?
What we've seen is really a massive stimulus bill that's recently been passed. And when it comes to spending to close the output gap, I think that the current administration and the previous administration have taken enormous steps in that direction. So I think that in terms of making sure that people can pay bills and they can get through the immediate crisis, I think we're absolutely seeing that the actions have been taken. So then the question is, what needs to be done to ensure an inclusive and full recovery in the longer term? And there we need to take a look at what some of the longer term damage has been. For example, we can start with maybe even the longest run potential damage, which is what kind of harm has happened to our children over the past year from being out of school, but also from mental health stress. And are we going to be doing enough to get our kids back on track so that they can be, as productive and successful as adults as they would have been if we hadn't had the pandemic? And, we're seeing some steps in the right direction there where we're, more spending for schools, trying to get schools reopened in the United States. I think, globally, there's a question as to, where kids have really suffered and what we'll need to do to invest in them. And I don't think that's a short run. What do we need to do just in the next year? But also, over the next 5 to 10 years, trying to make sure that they can catch up on lost learning that they've done. So besides children, then we can think about young adults who've lost their entry path into the right career. And have we done enough to try to get them back on the right path? Graduating in a recession has lifelong wage and career implications, negative career and wage implications. And so sometimes there's some things we need to do there. But I think the biggest challenge is going to be for workers who have had to shift out of their sector, and those jobs are never coming back. And do we really have the right training programs in place? How are we thinking about increasing flexibility in labor markets so that we create paths back for these workers into new jobs, into new industries, so that we encourage people maybe who stepped out and retired early because they were afraid of COVID to come back and do something productive, whether it's volunteer work or working for paid work. How do we get women back in the economy? So there's a lot of questions about helping recover. And then I would say there's one more set of bucket, which is how do we create a safety net that's going to work better in the case of future pandemics and better support families? And what kind of learning did we have from this pandemic about what families need in order for us to have an inclusive economy? And I think that's where the work hasn't even really begun, but we really need to start to think about how we support children, how we provide access to paid leave for sickness, for both short run and sort of longer run sickness. Those are things the United States has been terrible at. And so I think that's something that we now know really has to be fixed, along with other things like childcare and flexible workplaces, and the ways in which our work needs to adapt to the 21st century.
And what is your take on what some economists are calling a female recession or a she-cession, where a growing number of women are dropping out of the workforce? Why is this happening and how can it be addressed?
So women got hit by a triple punch with this COVID-based recession. The first punch was that this is the first service sector-led recession we've ever seen in the United States. Most recessions hit the goods sector the hardest. So if you go back to 2008, the goods producing sector where we make stuff is disproportionately men. It's only 20% of the economy, but in the 2008 recession, it was 50% of the jobs lost. Now, here in the 2020 recession, it was a service sector-led recession, and women hold the majority of jobs in the service sector. And not only that, but it really tended to hit some of the sectors hardest where women hold the vast majority of jobs. So even education and health services, people think it's a health crisis. Why'd we lose health workers? Well, a lot of people weren't doing non-essential health treatments. So we saw a loss of jobs in education and health services. That's an industry that's more than 75% women. And so women lost their jobs there early on in March and April and May. Retail sales, leisure and hospitality, those are all industries where women hold the majority of jobs and they lost the majority of jobs. So that's punch number one. Then what happens in the second punch is what you mentioned, which is children came home from school. So a lot of these women were sent home. Let's imagine you have a dental hygienist. Her dentist's office has closed. She's been laid off. Her kids are home from school. Summer comes. The office starts thinking about opening. And she's like, there's no summer camp. Where am I going to send my kids? Well, maybe I'll go back in September when school reopens. And then school doesn't reopen in September. So she finally says, look, I'm not coming back. And that's the dropping out of the labor force. And so that's sort of the second punch. And then the third punch has been really about state and local governments is starting to have state and local government job loss. And that as state and local government revenues decline, they lay off workers. Those workers are disproportionately women because women are disproportionately likely to be government workers. So you've got these three things going on. So that's what made this such a hard recession for women. I don't think it's about women all voluntarily saying, I'm going to stay home to look after my kids. It's a situation where they lost a lot of jobs. They were put in situations where maybe they couldn't go back to those jobs. And then even women who held on to jobs, a lot of them looked at their household income and found, well, I earn less than my husband and somebody's got to cut back their hours in order to look after the kids. So, one of the things that COVID did was really took a crowbar and pried open gender gaps and said, look, here's this gender gap. And it just really shredded it in a way that made things a lot harder for women. And then even the women who've kept their jobs, I think sometimes this gets overlooked, but not among women and moms that get interviewed by the papers and in the media that I talk to, is even the ones who kept their job have just found that they've had much more work to do at home looking after their kids. Again, it's their small gender gaps. Maybe the woman was doing 60% of the work at home and the husband was doing 40%. And that wasn't so bad prior to COVID. But once everything comes inside the house, including schooling, 60-40 becomes a really big gap in terms of the amount of work to be done. So you've got a lot of women stressed and on the verge of burnout. So I don't think we're done with this female trauma really around COVID. We're no longer clearly in the recession part, but I don't think women are done paying the price in terms of a hit to their jobs and employment.
What advice would you give emerging markets to help them build a more equitable society?
It's a very different thing when we start by, looking at the United States, a developed country, and then you pivot to emerging markets. We're seeing gender gaps happening there as well. But one of the things that's happening is as families get desperate, women, or we might say girls, are getting married at even younger ages. We're seeing a lack of access to sort of the fundamentals for young women, like birth control. So we want to make sure you don't roll back progress that has been made in terms of giving control over fertility and investing in girls' education. So another thing we're seeing is families are struggling, it's the boys' education that gets prioritized. So I think my first advice is, let's do what we can to not roll back the gender progress that has been in emerging economies. In our current era, I think, women's labor has shown that it's incredibly important to have a successful economy. And what we've learned in Western countries is that equality in the home goes hand in hand with equality in the in workplaces. So in developed countries, there is this synergy between equality at home and equality in the workplace. And so, I think paying attention to what's happening inside homes and what public policy can do to shape equality inside households can help shape equality in the economy, and equality in the economy can help foster economic growth.
The theme of this year's Asian Investment Conference is Disruption Accelerated. What, in your view, does that mean for US-China relations and the future of the global economy?
I love this theme, disruption accelerated, because I think it is exactly the right way to describe what happened with COVID. We had disruption that happens, all the time, and we see technology. I've been doing a lot of focus on how technology was introducing disruptions into economies around the world, but it was doing it at a very slow pace, and the pandemic sped that pace up enormously. But it also did speed up some of these global tensions between the United States and China, for instance. So I think if you're thinking about that theme, we're seeing, I think, people turning a little bit more inward, and we're going to have to try to recover from that so people can be reminded of the benefits of this sort of free exchange around the globe. I know a lot of human progress over the last 40 years has come from global progress in trade, both physical trade, but also intellectual trade. What has been accelerated, the progress that's been accelerated, is our ability to communicate remotely. The fact that it doesn't matter where you're located globally, you can look for the best person for your job, you can look for the best school to attend if you're a student, and we don't necessarily always have to do everything in person. So this should improve our ability to take advantage of the best the world has to offer. But at the same time, I think we've also seen an acceleration of fear of the unknown and fear of the foreign that we're going to have to overcome in order to take advantage of those potential gains.
Thank you, Professor Stevenson.